This video is reviewing the musculature of the lower leg, ankle, and foot. Starting with the anterior view, we can see on the posterior side, we can see the gastrocnemius, which we can also see on the posterior side here. We have the medial head, and then we have the lateral head. And then we can also see it on the posterior view from the lateral side. Again, this would be the lateral head. Deep to the gastrocnemius, we have the soleus, which we can also see here and here, as well as deep again to the gastrocnemius on the posterior side. Looking at the anterior view, on the lateral side of the tibia, we have our tibialis anterior. On the medial side of the tibia, we can also see our flexor digitorum longus. Moving to the lateral side, immediately lateral of our tibialis anterior is our extensor hallucis longus. We can identify that because we can follow the tendon all the way down through the big toe. And then lateral to our extensor hallucis longus, we can identify in the foot the extensor digitorum tendon, so we can follow that up into our extensor digitorum longus. Which we can follow up kind of that lateral anterior portion of the lower leg. Looking at the lateral view, we can also see that extensor digitorum longus and extensor hallucis longus. Again, we can identify the tendons moving down into the foot of the extensor digitorum longus, and then we can follow that muscle up into the lower leg. Anterior of that, we have our extensor hallucis longus. And then posterior to that, we have our peroneal muscles. So the top muscle that is a bipennate muscle is our peroneus longus. And then deep to that we can see towards the inferior aspect is our peroneus brevis. And these muscles go behind the lateral malleolus, so we can identify them as they come around, with the brevis tendon being the brevis tendon being closer to the malleolus than the longus tendon. Moving to the deeper layer, again we see our soleus on the posterior side that we can see here from the slightly more anterior view, and then here on the lateral side. It's also important to note that the soleus and the gastroc combine at the inferior aspect to form our Achilles or our calcaneal tendon. Looking at the anterior side, here we can see our extensor hallucis longus in its entirety. Again, we can identify that muscle by tracking its tendon down onto the first toe. And just to the lateral aspect of that, we have our extensor digitorum longus. And we can see those from the lateral view as well. So here is our extensor hallucis longus and our extensor digitorum longus. We can also see our flexor digitorum longus. That would be deep to the soleus. And then looking again at our lateral view, we can identify our peroneus longus, as well as our peroneus brevis, and here we can also see our peroneus tertius, which is the only peroneus or peroneal muscle on the anterior side of the fibula. Moving deep to the soleus, here again we see our peroneus tertius, and then we can see our extensor hallucis longus, our peroneus longus, and our peroneus brevis, again, that come down and wrap behind the lateral malleolus. If we look more towards the medial side of the lower leg, we can see our flexor digitorum longus, and deep to that, the small muscle underneath is our tibialis posterior. And here we can see our flexor digitorum longus again, and then our tibialis posterior would be deep to that. You can barely see it at the bottom. And then here we would have our flexor hallucis longus, which you can see the tendon of it down here at the bottom. All three of these muscles run behind the medial malleolus at the ankle. Again, our flexor digitorum longus, tibialis posterior, and our flexor hallucis longus. Looking at our posterior view, we can also see our tibialis posterior deep to the flexor hallucis longus and flexor digitorum longus, kind of between the tibia and the fibula. On the lateral side here, we can also see our peroneus longus again. Moving through the next layer, here we can see our tibialis posterior, which can also be seen from the anterior view between the two. On the lateral side, again, we have our peroneus longus, which we can also see here, as well as on the lateral view. Underneath that, we would have our peroneus brevis and our peroneus tertius. Looking now at the muscles in the foot, here again we can identify the tendons of our extensor digitorum longus, and deep to those tendons we have our extensor digitorum brevis. Here we can identify our extensor hallucis longus, as well as our extensor hallucis brevis. On the sole of the foot, here we see our flexor digitorum brevis, and underneath our flexor digitorum brevis, we can identify the tendons of our flexor digitorum longus. In between each of the toes, we find the lumbricals, here running obliquely, as well as this muscle running on an angle, is our adductor hallucis. Underneath the great toe, here we can see the tendons of our flexor digitorum longus, our flexor hallucis longus. And underneath that tendon, we can see it on both sides. We have our flexor hallucis brevis. Located on the medial and kind of plantar aspect of the great toe, we have our abductor hallucis. And then on the opposite side with the pinky toe, we have our abductor digiti minimi. And then again, deep to our flexor digitorum brevis, we can see the tendon of our flexor digitorum longus, which we can track all the way down to the end of the toes.